Ruled by the mob until they brought in a secret weapon. Chicago in the Roaring Twenties. It was Al Capone's private empire, fueled by bootleg liquor and controlled by political corruption.
Nobody kills like Capone.
Then the Untouchables came on the scene, skilled lawmen who couldn't be bought.
That's what made the Untouchables a novelty. They would not take the bribes.
In 1928, the situation in Chicago was out of control. The federal government created a special task force to clean up a lawless city and put away the man who was its chief terrorist, Al Capone. The legendary Elliot Ness put together a team to accomplish this mission. Who are the men behind Elliot Ness? What is the true story of the Untouchables?
Gambling, racketeering, murder. Organized crime is a deadly fact of life in America.
A man walked in from the back door. There was a total of 14 shots fired.
The direction remains silent. Anything you say can will be used.
A venture so powerful as to operate in all 5 boroughs of the city of New York.
Fighting organized crime calls for the most accomplished and dedicated law enforcement agents. Yet not so long ago, there were almost no lawmen willing or able to tackle the mob. Chicago, 1928. Bootleg liquor, drive-by shootings, and ruthless crime lords rule the city. Until an elite federal task force takes on the most notorious gang in U.S. history.
Elliot Ness picked 9 guys, much like himself, all young. They were beyond the reach of the gangsters, tough, fast, and smart.
The press dubbed them the Untouchables. But how could a handful of lawmen hope to enforce prohibition laws that millions of Americans scorned?
Chicago was corrupt from top to bottom, from the officer on the beat all the way up to City Hall.
Were the Untouchables mob-busting lawmen or simply publicity hounds?
We have a lot of detail about Ness, but most of the Untouchables, or virtually all the Untouchables, are shrouded in mystery.
The only way to separate truth from legend is to go back to the days when Chicago was at war with itself. The heyday of Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. Ironically, the crime wave that would spawn the Untouchables was set in motion by a crusade to deliver America from the evils of drink. Prohibition. At the turn of the century, church leaders, feminists, and politicians unite under the banner of the temperance movement. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union exhort their followers to banish liquor from American life.
I don't drink, and I will do all I can to keep you from drinking. Amen, amen, amen.
The movement's political arm, the Anti-Saloon League, lobbies to turn prayers into public policy. And in 1919, temperance activists rammed through a constitutional amendment banning the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. On January 16, 1920, the nation savors its last legal drink.
The 18th Amendment tried to legislate morality on people who didn't want to have morality legislated on them, and most people saw no reason to stop drinking beer, wine, whiskey, just because Washington, D.C. had passed a law saying that it was now illegal.
This perhaps was the most unpopular law ever adopted in any nation. Honest people, Chicago people, did not think it was a crime to go into a speakeasy and order scotch and soda.
Soon it's clear the noble experiment has backfired. Booze is bigger than ever. Instead of ushering in a gilded age of morality, prohibition opens the door to an orgy of lawlessness.
It involved ordinary Americans of all walks of life for the first time in routine law-breaking. A working man drinking a beer was breaking the law. A hostess serving a cocktail party was breaking a law. A politician celebrating a victory and breaking out the booze was breaking the law. That kind of massive law-breaking by Americans was novel.
Along with illegal status, drinking picks up an air of glamour. Socialites and social climbers flock to the non-stop party of the speakeasies, and no town in America embraces the high times with greater gusto than Chicago.
Welcome everybody, here we are at the old Max Club in Chicago, where every night is New Year's Eve.
I think when Prohibition kicked in, people felt a little more inclined to take advantage of that forbidden fruit. The aura of being a little bit naughty, I think, pervaded in Chicago. Also made a lot of money for the underworld.
Bootleg liquor becomes the city's lifeblood. Prohibition offers racketeers a golden opportunity, and quenching Chicago's illicit thirst turns small-time hoods into the most powerful men in town.
There had been mobs in the United States, varying sizes, for many years, and they had been involved in the illegal sale of alcohol. What happened during Prohibition was that there was this whole huge new market, all liquor sales, not just Sundays, not just after hours, not just in forbidden places. All liquor sales were now illegal, and illegality is opportunity for a smart young entrepreneur.
Crime gets organized like never before. In Chicago, doing business or running for office means cutting a deal with the mob.
Well, Chicago had always been famous for having the best government that money could buy. And in the 1920s, there was a lot more money with which to buy politicians than there ever had been before.
Al Capone estimated at one point in time that something like 50% of the Chicago police force was on his own payroll. A number of Chicago politicians were, in fact, not just taking money from gangsters, but were in a sense run by the gangsters, all the way up to the mayor, Big Bill Thompson.
Fueled by sky-high profits, the underworld explodes. Using intimidation and graft, a handful of crime bosses carve up the city into private empires. Routine turf battles flare into deadly shootouts.
In Chicago, in the course of the 1920s, it was officially estimated that there was something on the order of 410 or 30 gangland murders, overwhelmingly unsolved. No other city matched that, and no other time in American history matched that kind of a body count.
In 1923, a brutal young enforcer rides the tide of violence to the top of Chicago's South Side mob. His name, Alphonse Capone.
He was a killer, he was a briber, he was a pimp, he was a seducer, and he violated the law.
After seizing the reins of the most lucrative crime syndicate in the country, Capone takes on the competition. The streets of Chicago erupt in a full-blown gangland war.
Capone was trying what none of the rest of them did, actually to establish an empire over the whole of the city of Chicago.
From gambling dens to the track, Big Al takes a cut of all the action. Mob profits soar to unimagined new heights, yet many Chicago police just seem to look the other way. And it's not just Chicago. All across the nation, an epidemic of local corruption forces the U.S. Treasury Department to take over the job of enforcing the liquor laws. Treasury officials announced the birth of a new force of Prohibition agents.
By July the 15th, the new army, 2,000 strong, will be in motion to strike against those who are getting rich by breaking the law.
The United States has roughly 19,000 miles of border, and they figured that they were going to deal with that with 2,000, inside and out, with 2,000 federal agents paid roughly $45 a week. It didn't work out that way.
In Chicago, the Prohibition agents are overwhelmed by the magnitude of Capone's empire. Hundreds of speakeasies and breweries, resources that give the mobster more than enough cash to buy off the bureau.
There was all kinds of pressure on Prohibition agents to accept bribes. They could double, maybe triple their income and live a lot longer if they did not do their job.
With the city awash in bullets and bribes, many Prohibition raids are no more than photo ops, stunts staged to appease federal officials and amuse the press. Out on the street, pressure to repeal Prohibition is growing. The controversy reaches a crescendo at the 1928 Republican National Convention, held on the front lines of the struggle, Chicago. The party's leaders remain committed to supporting the liquor laws, despite widespread hostility.
The duty of the President and of the officers of the law is clear. The law must be enforced as they find it enacted by the people. To these courses of action, we pledge our nominee.
The Republicans have been in power for almost 8 years, but they've paid little more than lip service to Prohibition. Their new nominee, Herbert Hoover, promises to do more.
Hoover was elected in 1928, firmly committed to this noble experiment. And a guy like Al Capone was just a thorn in his side. I mean, here was Capone holding news conferences in a silk bathrobe, flaunting his disrespect for the law, and the President of the United States said, "This has got to stop."
The job of stopping the flamboyant mobster falls on George E.Q. Johnson, Special U.S. Attorney for Cook County, Illinois. He is appointed by the Justice Department to clean up local prohibition enforcement. Chicago born and bred, Johnson hates how Capone has degraded his hometown.
Our beautiful city of Chicago was the home of Al Capone. There's no doubt about that. But this is also the home of my father. Now, there wasn't room in Chicago for both of them, and one had to go. And my father's mission was, it'll be Al Capone.
But George Johnson is a lawyer, not a lawman. To bring down Capone, he'll need to find men willing to risk their lives to put the bootleggers behind bars. Chicago, Illinois, 1928. After 8 years of prohibition, the Midwestern metropolis is America's capital for bootleg liquor and gangland crime. And with the mayor and the cops firmly in the pocket of Al Capone, every attempt to shut down the mob has turned up dead on arrival. But in the fall of '28, President-elect Herbert Hoover calls for a crackdown on Chicago's crime lords.
There was a lot of pressure on the federal government to try to arrest the growth of the underworld. President Herbert Hoover commissioned really a two-pronged attack. The Treasury Department would pursue Al Capone's outfit with an investigation of tax evasion. The second part of the federal attack was the Justice Department and the prohibition enforcement against Al Capone and other Chicago outfits.
Curiously, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover keeps his agents out of prohibition enforcement. Hoover fears that taking on the bootleggers could infect his elite bureau with the bribery and corruption that have crippled the Treasury Department. George Johnson must build a new force from scratch.
In large part because of the fact that the Treasury agents had proved ineffective, and because local law enforcement was hopelessly corrupt. They started a new group within the Justice Department, headed by a young man who was just 26 years old, recently out of the University of Chicago, a young man named Elliot Ness.
A novice insurance investigator who still lives with his parents, Elliot Ness seems an unlikely choice to spearhead the battle. But U.S. Attorney Johnson is convinced that what Ness lacks in experience, he'll make up for in nerve, know-how, and a lifelong passion for law enforcement.
Elliot Ness was a native of the Chicago area, the son of Norwegian immigrants. His interest in crime fighting, detective work, and law enforcement dates way back into his childhood. Even in elementary school, Elliot Ness's schoolmates say he would be sitting off in a corner reading Sherlock Holmes novels.
In September of 1928, Johnson hires Ness to build a new strike force for the Prohibition Bureau, giving the young agent a chance to realize his childhood dreams.
He felt like he was defending all that was good about America against all that was evil.
Ness knows that to succeed and build a reputation as a gangbuster, he'll need to put together a team of experienced crime fighters.
He was looking for specific skills. He needed somebody who was a good driver. He needed somebody who was a wiretapper. He needed somebody that was very good at following people.
Ness scours law enforcement roles across the country for young men like himself, top-notch marksmen with spotless records and a taste for risky business.
Many officers that became untouchables thirsted for more action. They wanted to get involved in the battle against the underworld.
Ness names Marty Lahart his chief lieutenant. An outstanding athlete and an expert in martial arts, Lahart is always ready to go hand-to-hand with Capone's thugs. The next agent Ness hires is Sam Seeger. A former prison guard from the federal penitentiary at Sing Sing, Seeger knows from experience how to handle deadly criminals. But muscle isn't all Ness needs. It will take brains and finesse, as well as brawn, to shut down the rackets. Paul Robsky, an ex-Marine from Illinois, is recruited to the task force for his expertise in wiretapping. Joining Robsky on the phone lines will be Barney Clunan. As his son recalls, the barrel-chested Irishman brought more than just technical skills.
He was a big man, robust and healthy. I think mainly he was an agent like other agents, but I think that Ness felt that he had high integrity. He was strong. He'd just come back from the Marines a few years ago fighting in France, and I guess he felt that he would be good at doing the crashing into places or whatever they had to do.
3 experienced detectives form the core of the undercover squad. Tom Friel, a wiry state trooper out of Scranton, Pennsylvania, signs on for the risky work of infiltrating the rackets from within. Mike King, an honest officer out of the Virginia Prohibition Bureau, relies on disguises to trail suspects undetected through the streets. And from stealthy tailing to high-speed chases, when the gangsters take to the road, wheelman Joe Leeson will lead the pursuit. But not all the detective work is in the field.
He needed somebody that was very good at paperwork in terms of taking documents captured in raids and working through those and learning what you could learn from it.
Lyle Chapman takes on the role of intelligence analyst. A war vet and a graduate of Colgate University, Chapman brings a scholar's insight to unraveling the bootlegger's paper trail. Despite their fame in years to come, for most of the Untouchables, little biographical information has survived. Still, one agent stands out. In his mid-40s, the old man of the squad, lawyer, all-star football player, and Chippewa Indian, Bill Gardner. As a youth, Gardner was sent from his tribal home on the Western Plains to the Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to be taught the white man's ways. After Carlisle, Gardner receives a law degree from nearby Dickinson College. Reflecting the ideals of the day, the school's 1907 yearbook celebrated the Native Americans' assimilation.
Well, what a great stride it is from the blanket-clothed Indian of history to this modern, well-groomed representative of his race, popular on the athletic field as well as in the parlors of society.
Ness hopes Gardner and the others will form an elite team that will rise to the top of the Prohibition Bureau. His ultimate goal? To take on public enemy number 1, Big Al Capone.
Despite some of the lowly gangsters that Ness was pursuing early in his career, he thought he was hot on the trail of Al Capone.
Winter, 1929. On the streets of Chicago, the weather is freezing. But in the gin joints, the nights are hot. But things are about to change. A string of raids on speakeasies run by small-time hoods announces a new force on the scene. Lawmen who take prohibition seriously.
Elliot Ness was an exception because he was an honest prohibition agent. He started out quite aggressive.
In the midst of the Untouchables' hard-charging debut comes an event that changes forever the landscape of gangland Chicago. On February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, Capone's biggest competitor gets an unexpected visit.
This was a day on the north side of Chicago. A number of people had gotten together in a warehouse which was generally believed to have been operated by Bugs Moran's bootlegger crew.
A car pulled up. Inside the car, 3 guys dressed as cops, a couple of others not. And they figured, hey, it's another one of those sham raids for the newspapers. Have to look as though the cops are attempting to enforce the law. And so the cops are, you know, just like, it's like Claude Rains in Casablanca. You know, they're shocked to discover that they're actually gangsters here in Chicago, and they may be dealing liquor. Can you imagine that? And so they asked these guys to put their hands against the wall and lean over, and they did. And then they were all machine-gunned to death.
Reporters rushed to the murder scene. Newsrooms nationwide labeled the grisly attack the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
One reporter of the day remarked that as he walked through the scene of carnage, he and his colleague had more brains on the soles of their shoes than under their hats.
Moran had it right when he said, nobody kills like Capone.
Although the killers masquerade as cops, both to fool their victims and throw blame on the police, the target of the hit makes Capone's gunmen the obvious suspects.
Bugs Moran was a competitor of Al Capone and stood in Capone's way in Capone's march into the north side of the city of Chicago.
Yet Moran himself escapes the slaughter. According to legend, Bugs slept in that day. 1,000 miles away at his winter compound in Palm Beach, Big Al claims his hands are clean.
Nobody has ever officially tied Capone to this murder, as they did not officially tie Capone, in fact, to any homicide.
The horrific assault and the mob's cynical attempt to frame the police galvanized public outrage. Regardless of who pulled the trigger, Capone will feel the heat.
It shocked even the city of Chicago. It shocked Chicago. In some respects, that sounded the death knell for Big Al Capone. I mean, that was too much.
Armed citizens take to the streets, and vigilante justice threatens to turn Chicago into a shooting gallery.
I've just been looking at the paper here, and I see that you men came down here to shoot gangsters. What inspired you to do that?
Well, I saw why they'd been shooting up children down here, and thought I'd come down and take a crack at them.
The way to get these birds is to go after them like they go after you, with guns.
The streets of Chicago are flooded with deadly new weapons.
The glamorous new weapon was the Tommy gun, invented during World War I, but never really used during the war. Hit the streets of Chicago about 1925-26.
With a squeeze of the machine gun's trigger, any second-rate marksman could become a first-class killer.
Rate of fire was something around 1,000 rounds per minute. Called the trench gun, Chicago piano, Chicago typewriter. It really changed the way criminals did business. It was a weapon to be feared.
Automatic weapons aren't the only innovation to raise the level of violence.
A speeding Buick meant that you could spray an opponent's saloon with bullets from a Tommy gun. It also meant that you could, it's one of the phrases of the time, you could take someone for a ride from which he would not return. If you shot someone down, you could speed away quickly.
In the wake of the bloody St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the public demands that someone shut down Capone. In the spring of 1929, the Untouchables are ordered to take on the job. Ness knows he is outmanned and outgunned. He can't hope to win an outright war with the mob. His strategy is to hit Capone where it hurts, in the pocketbook.
Ness wanted to use the Prohibition law really as a hammer against Capone and the larger outfits. It's evident that his goal really wasn't to enforce the Prohibition law so much as to eat away at Capone's rising income.
Ness sets his sight on drying up the source of Capone's profits, his network of breweries.
It wasn't hard to find the breweries. Ness posted officers at the speakeasies. They would trace the trucks back to the barrel cleaning factories or the breweries.
On other occasions, they got tips, anonymous phone calls, seemingly either from the public or possibly from other gangsters in Chicago, letting them know where the breweries were.
Until now, targeting mob breweries was unheard of. Astonished to face genuine enforcement of the liquor laws, at first the bootleggers barely put up a fight.
The raids were somewhat uneventful. Ness and the group would break into the breweries, They'd seize equipment. They'd make an occasional arrest. The employees of the breweries were basically instructed by Capone not to offer resistance. They were told to just run or surrender, realizing they'd probably get easy treatment by the crooked judges anyhow.
The Untouchables leave their calling card, broken barrels and a river of beer. The aggressive tactics of this new federal task force provoked Capone to plan a surprise for Ness and his men. Extra security measures at the breweries.
I think on one of Ness's earliest raids, they had a little bit of a problem. They thought they were just going to walk in there. They found that the door was steel-plated, and a long time later, when they finally hammered through the door, of course, anybody that might have been there was long gone. So what they did in response to that was, on one of the trucks, they mounted the equivalent of a snowplow, sort of a spike, and then they would just drive the truck with the ram in the front right through the doors.
After Ness's battering ram takes out several of Capone's biggest operations, at last the feds seem to be taking the upper hand. In his daybook, never before made public, Agent Barney Clunan records the pace of the raids.
Thursday, August 15th. 3 20-gallon cases of mash, 1,000 bottles of brew destroyed. Thursday, October 3rd. Large still in operation. Found and destroyed.
It's estimated that Elliot Ness busted up maybe $1 million or so worth of Capone breweries, Capone saloons, Capone trucks, confiscated Capone weapons.
But with Capone taking in more than $100 million a year, he can afford to absorb the loss. Chicago, 1930. As the Roaring Twenties give way to the Depression, the Untouchables are beginning to cut into mob profits and carefully building a legal case against the king of the bootleggers, Al Capone. Facing increased federal pressure, Capone issues orders to buy off Ness and his supposedly incorruptible task force.
There's one story of gangsters chasing a car with a couple of Ness's men in it, and Ness's Untouchables fearing for their lives, but yet when the gangsters pulled up, they didn't throw a hand grenade into the car, they threw a wad of bills into the car as a crude bribery attempt.
It was very common to bribe federal agents, and usually very successful, and that's what made the Untouchables a novelty. They would not take the bribes.
As their reputation grows, Ness and his men pick up their memorable nickname.
The first reference to the Untouchables appeared in a newspaper article in Chicago. A columnist recognized the novelty of a group of Prohibition agents that was honest, that did have the courage to hold Capone and the larger criminal outfits accountable.
The public fanfare feeds Ness's need for recognition, his lifelong ambition to be known as the best lawman of his day.
Ness, if he had a weakness, it wasn't for money, it was for publicity.
Ness uses the press both as a stepping stone to fame and a tool in his crusade.
Ness did tip off newspaper reporters of impending raids. He has been labeled a glory hound, a publicity seeker. From my research, I think that Ness realized if he would get publicity for these long overdue raids, that he would instill public confidence in law enforcement.
But Ness's ties to the press sometimes backfire.
He limited his effectiveness because a number of the Chicago reporters were no more incorruptible than the Chicago policemen, and therefore he probably helped to tip Capone off to some extent when he let the reporters and news photographers know ahead of time that, hey guys, we're going on a raid.
Not all of the squad's operations make the news. As Agent Barney Clunan records in his diary, building an airtight legal case against a mob calls for months of painstaking undercover work.
Wednesday, April 24th. Spent day and evening looking for beer trucks and supposed still. Car fare, 35 cents. Monday, May 20th. Spent day looking for fugitives.
They would have to follow these guys for days and days and sometimes weeks to try to find out where these places were located. And of course they didn't have any electronic technology back then, so they would have to be very good at tailing vehicles in traffic without blowing their cover.
To help track the gangsters, the task force secretly outfits mob cars and trucks with a clever low-tech device, the drip can.
That was a can that would drop drops of oil. It was attached under the axle of a vehicle, and as the vehicle left, it would leave drops of oil, basically a path to follow.
There are many pitfalls in that. You oftentimes would lose the person you were tailing without trying to get too close to tip them off.
But in this game of hide and seek, the bootleggers have their own tricks to play.
Police have tough time catching rum runners who employ smokescreen as aid in evading capture. But perseverance wins, and that's not jar of preserves he's found. Very clever, these bootleggers.
And where there's smoke, there's often fire. The gangster's murderous arsenal runs the gamut from switchblades to Tommy guns to hand grenades. Early on, the mob violence claims one of the Untouchables' closest allies. After exposing a plot to knife Ness in the back, ex-con turned undercover man Frank Bazile turns up with a bullet in the head. The Untouchables' successes prompt Capone and his hitmen to send a lethal message. One evening after work, Ness notices that the hood of his car is open.
He raised the hood slightly and he saw that there was some dynamite and some wires. So they had actually wired it up to the engine electrical system. So if he would have gotten in and started it, then he would have been blown up. If they used 2 or 3 sticks of dynamite and had it right by the firewall, he would not have survived.
Not everyone believes Ness's story.
I question whether there were any actual attempts on the life of Elliot Ness or the Untouchables. I think they probably were threatened, but Capone realized it would not be in his best interest to be killing a federal agent. The public uproar would be considerable. Al Capone was too smart to do that.
In their battle of nerve and wits, Ness knows that to bring down Capone, he'll need rock-solid evidence. Tapping the mob's phone lines holds the greatest promise, but it's not without risk.
Back then, one of the Untouchables would actually climb a pole behind one of these places and he would physically tap into the wires. And so that was very dangerous if someone saw him up there.
Months of listening in on the phones at the Montmartre Cafe, home base for Capone's brother Ralph, eventually lays bare Big Al's orders and chain of command, evidence that could send Capone to prison.
The wiretap on Ralph Capone's hotel did yield some great evidence. A lot of leads came from that wiretap.
For 3 years, Elliot Ness and his federal task force pursue the bootleggers of Chicago. But despite a mountain of evidence and the indictment of mob underlings, the Untouchables are unable to bring the city's crime boss, Al Capone, to trial.
You could not get convictions in violation of the Prohibition law. For perhaps you had a jury assessing the guilt or innocence of an accused. And he says to myself, why should I put in jail all the people that are feeding me things that I want? It just did not work.
While the Untouchables keep the heat on Capone, surprisingly, the most effective attack comes from a team of accountants.
The strategy of the feds was to get Capone on income tax evasion, and that proved to be a very successful strategy.
Since the beginning, Ness's boss, U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, has shared the Untouchables' findings with their counterparts in the Treasury Department. Elmer L. Irie directs the IRS's intelligence unit investigating big-ticket tax evasion. To document Capone's income, Elmer Irie relies on a pair of intrepid investigators.
2 accountants working for the Treasury Department, A.P. Madden and Frank Wilson, were brilliant men. They worked hand in glove with my father, day and night, to identify income, to identify documents, and then trace them to Capone.
Capone was very thorough, or he had people around him that were very thorough in their bookkeeping, so there was quite an evidence trail.
Despite the seizure of detailed mob records, Capone's personal income proves almost impossible to document.
He generated $100 million of income a year. Now, the United States Attorney could only prove $215,000, but that was enough to do it.
After a tense, highly publicized trial, on October 24, 1931, the murderous gangster is found guilty for failing to pay his taxes.
Mr. Alphonse Capone, alias the Big Shot, has met the enemy and he is there. It won't be long now before the world's most notorious gangster will be only an offensive memory.
For all of Elliot Ness's ambition and the years of chasing Capone, the final glory escapes him. There is, in fact, no proof that the two adversaries ever came face to face.
Ness might have gotten sight of Capone by being part of the unit that escorted Al Capone to the train station when he was sent to the federal prison. But there's no evidence whatsoever that they ever met during Ness's years as a Prohibition agent.
Just a year after Capone's downfall, Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected president. On December 5, 1933, he signs a bill repealing Prohibition after 13 dry years. The Untouchables' job is over. Ness's task force has already been dissolved without fanfare, and for the most part, little notice is taken of the fate of his men.
Some of the members of the Untouchables have been lost in history. One has to remember that the Untouchables were not famous until long after they disbanded.
Lyle Chapman, Ness's chief of intelligence, re-enlists in the Army, becoming a major in World War II. Later he makes his living as a football handicapper. Wiretapper Paul Robesky battles whiskey smugglers in Florida and later works as a security guard. Record keeper Barney Clunan continues to serve with the Alcohol Bureau until his retirement. The other agents leave few clues to their fate, with one notable exception: Elliot Ness. In 1935, Ness turns his Chicago fame into a job as Cleveland's public safety director. But after early successes, his failure to solve a string of gruesome killings in the late 30s, the Torso murders, threatens his job and his crime-busting reputation. The final straw comes in the winter of '42, when he flees the scene of his own drunk driving accident.
Ness essentially, after making sure that everybody was okay, left the scene, which was something that as public safety director with your police training you're not supposed to do, and that led to calls for his resignation.
Within weeks, Ness steps down from his post. His life begins to spiral downward. 2 marriages both end in divorce. In 1947, a campaign for mayor of Cleveland leads to an embarrassing defeat. Just 43 years old, Elliot Ness, the Untouchable, is a has-been. 8 years later, in 1955, Ness meets sports writer Oscar Fraley in the bar of New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Captivated by the former Prohibition agent's breathless tales of his exploits in Chicago, Fraley convinces Ness to collaborate on a memoir. In 1957, after much exaggeration and fact-twisting, they finish their manuscript. But before it hits the presses, the 53-year-old Ness drops dead of a heart attack, never to know the mark his tale would leave.
In Elliot Ness's case, we know a lot, or we know as much as Ness wanted us to know, because he got to create his own legend. If Ness had never written that book, even Elliot Ness would have been forgotten by now.
Desi Arnaz options Fraley's book for television, and in 1959, with Robert Stack playing the hard-boiled Elliot Ness, The Untouchables becomes an instant success.
The American public really thirsted for more about the Untouchables. However, they ran out of material, and so, as Hollywood will do, they had to create their own plots.
The inventions of Hollywood don't sit well with everyone. Former Untouchable Barney Clunan criticizes the series for overplaying the violence.
There wasn't any shooting. Nobody got killed or even wounded.
It wasn't until The Untouchables came out on TV and my father was mentioned that started to ask him a few questions. But he kept saying that, you know, it was just a job.
Another veteran of the squad challenges the claims of The Untouchables' legendary honesty.
Paul Robesky in his own book recounts the names of several men not mentioned by Ness who he says did take some money from Capone and then were quietly either run out of the unit or left when it was found out that they were on the tape.
Regardless of whose memories are closer to the truth, the Untouchables made their mark on federal law enforcement.
Elliot Ness was one of the forefathers of what you currently see as alcohol, tobacco, and firearm agents.
Shooters on the line with a full magazine, load, charge, decock, and holster.
Training has changed, education has changed, but the basic common sense qualities of a good street investigator have never changed.
In the 70 years since the Untouchables took to the streets, the battle and the weapons have evolved.
It's a multi-level threat now. You see a lot more lawlessness having to do with explosives, a lot more firearm abuse, people willing to blow up federal buildings.
The dedication and expertise of today's federal agents are inspired in part by the example set by Elliot Ness and his team.
I always think you learn from your predecessors, so I'd like to be able to capture what they learned on the streets of Chicago and apply it to today.
Even if our perception of the Untouchables strays from the truth, Elliot Ness and his men still played a critical role in upholding the law of the land.
America, for some reason, seized upon the myth or the exaggerations of Elliot Ness. That's the legend that remains in place today. It's sad, but the true actions of Ness and his Untouchables have been lost in history.
In the end, perhaps we remember the Untouchables less for what they did than for what they came to stand for.
More than half a century after the Untouchables, the job of a federal agent is more challenging and dangerous than ever. The agents today have new weapons, but they also face new adversaries, battling drug smugglers, urban terrorists, and even computer crime. Another difference, crime fighting is no longer for men only. Hundreds of agents are women, performing the same jobs as their male counterparts. But one thing hasn't changed. Their best weapons are still courage and integrity.
Discover more about this and every History's Mysteries topic at HistoryChannel.com.